In my last video, I mentioned stories as being central to both science and religion. Because of the first part of this video, I want to show you first that stories are literally what the world is made of for us humans. The code of the matrix we live in is written in the language of stories, and therefore, if you want to be a driver and not a passenger in your life, you have to become aware of the code and understand it. Let me give you just a few examples of how stories define your life. The most striking example is famous paintings like Rembrandt. The originals are worth millions, but the fakes, which can be almost impossible to distinguish from the originals, are worth only thousands. What truly distinguishes the authentic from the fake is only the story around the artifact. You pay for the story, not the painting. And it's not just about paintings, it's like this with everything. Your nation is a story. For example, I'm Romanian. What does that mean? It means that there is a story, the story of who Romanians are, our history, and that history plays a special role for me. That story is who I am on an ethnic level. And so it is with you. Even if you do not consider yourself as having a nationality or ethnicity, you still have a story about how you got to be what you are. That story still defines you. Your political orientation is a story. If you're a socialist, that means the top story in your political worldview says that the business owners exploit the workers and the workers will unite to take control of their destiny. If you're a free market capitalist, that means your top story says that the free market allocates resources optimally, making life better for everyone. The story you prioritize defines who you are. Your family is a story. When the story collapses due to, say, infidelity, then the family itself collapses. The story is the family. Your mind is made of stories. A branch of psychology known as narrative psychology showed that we construct meaning, identity, and understanding of life through narratives, conscious or unconscious. Stories are a fundamental mode of thought, helping us organize experiences and construct meaning. Disruptions in these narratives can lead to anxiety or depression. Your mind is shaped by the stories you tell yourself, or that other people tell you. Your religion is all stories. Some of you may be religious, some may not be. Some of you might consider yourself spiritual but not religious. Whichever one it is, you still have some stories in your head about meaning in your life, or even lack thereof. The only difference is in which stories you choose to adopt or embody. The religions of the world are basically just systems of content filtering or content moderation on the kinds of stories which are allowed to get into people's heads. Think about the system Apple has for allowing apps on its platform, or Wikipedia has for allowing content on its pages, or Russia or China have for allowing stories on their news. Yeah, it's a tricky business. It can filter out harmful stuff, but it can also be blinding and confining in critical ways. It's debatable whether it's better to have a content filtering system, which may go wrong, like in the case of censorship, or no system at all. The point is, it's critical to be aware of the stories you allow into your head. They define you. Your job is probably also made of stories. In business, strategies or business cases are stories. Roadmaps are stories, project plans are stories, and even in software engineering, individual tasks are called stories. That is not accidental. Academic research is made of stories. Research grants are stories, and research papers are stories. Anyone who has written a scientific paper knows that how compelling the story one spins about the result and how it's positioned in relation to neighboring results is at least as important as the result itself. Science itself is actually made of stories. In particular, a scientific model or its computer-aided version, which we call simulation today, is basically a story. The big difference from all other stories we hear is that science models/stories are disembodied. You're not meant to identify with anything in the story. It's completely outside of you. And finally, generative artificial intelligence and its power is due to its ability to understand and produce stories. Both ChatGPT prompts and completions are best conceptualized as stories, but believe them at your own risk. To summarize, the point is that once you start to pay attention, you will notice this everywhere. Everyone is trying to tell you some stories, most often to get you to do something, to vote for someone or to buy something or to pay attention to something, or on the contrary, to distract your attention away from something, which is what entertainment is about. Stories are the invisible strings we use to influence each other as individuals, and also how mass movements like revolutions, wars, or migrations get started. It's common to say entertainment stories are like brain candy, but more importantly, stories are brain strings. A common image in psychology is the elephant and the rider, where the elephant is the emotional, automatic, instinctive side, or system 1, and the writer is the explicit, deliberate, planning, and logical thinker side, or system 2. In this picture, stories are the harness on the elephant's head, which the writer can turn in the direction he wants the elephant to go. Stories are a key way by which the small and powerless writer can influence the huge and powerful elephant. So the amount of agency in your life is directly proportional to how much attention you pay to the stories you tell yourself and that other people throw at you. So I hope I have convinced you that stories are vitally important in your life. Okay, but why? What's so special and magical about stories? This question is so deep and important that to understand it, we have to go all the way back to the origin of intelligence itself. This part is based on this book, which I extend with some ideas of my own, and from these other books, and this YouTube series, which I highly recommend. So, the history of intelligence starts with oxygen. That's right, oxygen gas. Turns out you can't do anything really interesting in biology without oxygen. There's just not enough energy around. But once the atmosphere started having oxygen around 2 billion years ago, that made energy more easily available and opened up a lot of possibilities. And first of all, predation. Chasing and eating other critters only becomes energetically worthwhile with oxygen around. And that kicks off an arms race of bigger and faster. And faster means especially faster reflexes, which requires fast information transmission. And that is how we got neurons. They evolved primarily as electric cables at first, not grouped into brains, just loosely connected nerve nets. Typical examples featuring this are corals, anemones, or jellyfish. So that is the first cognitive revolution. The second breakthrough was the first actual brain, which is a densely connected clump of neurons, and this happened with what are called bilaterians, basically worms or slugs. The whole point of brains was to facilitate purposeful and directed movement. Turns out, even just basic steering is a lot more complex than it seems, because it requires you to have some idea of where you want to go, which requires some understanding of direction, left or right, and valence, good versus bad, and most importantly, the ability to trade off between mixed good and bad signals. Sensory data is almost always contradictory and ambiguous, and the best trade-off depends on your internal state, like how hungry you are. The typical example is the C. elegans nematode worm. So that's the second cognitive revolution. The third major breakthrough was provided by vertebrates. They developed a map of the exterior world. They know where they are in space and don't just steer. They actually navigate around to where they want to go. However, this model does not contain the time dimension, so it's only a static map, not yet a story. Even though vertebrates definitely have precise awareness of time and ability to learn from time correlations, which bilaterians did not. But time is not yet incorporated into their models of the world, which remain static maps. The fourth breakthrough is where it starts to get interesting for us humans. It was about creating maps which include a time dimension, and that is what a story is. A story is basically a model of the world which includes space and time, and credit for that leap goes to the first mammals, though it has evolved independently in other animals like birds and cephalopods. This allowed them to plan, to simulate different courses of action in their minds, and decide which is the best course of action. An example of a typical mammal story, or simulation, is this. Instead of going in a straight line to get the juicy fruit, I should follow a longer path which is in the shadow of those dense bushes, then I will avoid being detected by a predator. However, these simulations were applied mainly to the external material world, and only in very limited ways to the animal's own or its colleagues' movements or intentions. We're almost halfway through the story of information processing, but I want to just pause here to note that once the story technology was discovered, the rest is just applying the same technology to more and more things and to higher levels of abstraction. So mammals are a very critical inflection point. This is seen also on a physiological level. The story-making machinery in the brain is called the neocortex, and it first appears in the early mammals. From that point on, the neocortex just grows massively, but its internal six-layered structure remains similar, with some tweaks of neuron or synaptic density or thickness of various layers. The point is, between mice and humans, most of the difference is quantitative. We just have a whole lot more neocortex, more dense connections within it, and therefore a whole lot more simulations, and simulations of simulations of simulations, which we call stories. When you look at a human brain, pretty much all you see is neocortex, 80% by weight. When you listen to a human speak and also act, pretty much all you see is stories, either verbal or embodied, like rituals. And the second thing I want to point out is that the ability to build models of the world with a time dimension is very similar to what we usually mean by free will. I'm not the first one to have noticed this. The ability to make embodied simulations, in other words, simulations that you are a part of, allows you to imagine different futures and to pick whichever one seems best. That is pretty much what free will is, because changing a model changes the organism's actual orientation in the world. Embodied stories are what makes free will possible. Okay, let's go back now to the history of intelligence. We were at breakthrough number 4. The fifth breakthrough of intelligence was repurposing the neocortex's ability to simulate different courses of action in the physical world towards simulating actions for influencing states of mind in a social world. This is what primates achieved. They're able to think about what others think. They can make plans about how to influence what others think. Here's an example of a story in a chimp's brain. I can groom and buddy up to this high-ranking chimp. Then other junior chimps will see that and will be afraid to pick on me, so my rank in the troop might increase, and I will get access to better food. Another way to say it is that primates can construct stories about stories, or meta-stories. The sixth breakthrough of intelligence obviously comes from humans, and that involves the ability to share stories. With primates, a simulation is still trapped in the head of one individual. No matter how brilliant the strategy is, other individuals can only observe and imitate the outside behavior, but they have no access to the story itself, to the simulation going on in the head of the individual who is performing the actions. But through speech, humans are able to transmit stories directly to other people, so people can learn quickly rather than slowly by repeated observation and trial and error. Here's an example of an early human story. I can go talk to Oog and give him a gift of juicy fruit, and then maybe he will teach me how he builds those fancy spears, which he even used to take down that buffalo the other day. Max Bennett's history of intelligence ends here, with the appearance of language and Homo sapiens 250,000 years ago. But this is just where it starts to get interesting. The most fascinating breakthroughs are yet to come. This is where Richard Dawkins' classic The Selfish Gene comes in, but probably not in a way that Dawkins himself would expect. The key observation is that how to make a better spear is not the only story people could tell once they had language. Here's an example of a wholly different kind of story that very likely got told at least as much as the spear-making kind. I can tell Oog that there is a stray buffalo in the next valley. Heck, might even be true. The fool might run out to hunt it down, and then I can stay behind and sleep with his wife while he's out. This type of story is critically important for the rest of the video, so we need a term for it. Lying is not quite right, since the person might not actually be lying. There could indeed be a buffalo in the next valley, and for the purposes of the author, it's actually better if it were true. The point is, it's not what the speaker actually cares about. John Vervaeke prefers the term used by Harry Frankfurt in his famous essay on bullshit. Bullshit stories are stories that are indifferent to truth or falsehood, but rather manipulative in a self-interested way. This is the right concept, but I don't like the term because it could be easily confused with meaningless or pointless gibberish, which is the opposite of what we're trying to convey. This kind of story is coherent and meaningful, but driven by the selfish interest of only one person. A better term is propaganda, so I will use this term for the rest of this video. Language enables knowledge sharing and learning on steroids, a whole new level of adaptability and evolution, but it also enables manipulation and abuse at a whole new level too. Language in the beginning was a blessing, but even more so, a curse. In the absence of an immune system against excessive out-of-control propaganda, language is an evolutionary trap. This might explain why humans got so little benefit from it evolution-wise. Homo erectus, which did not have language, expanded out of Africa and into Asia and Indonesia 1.5 million years ago. But early Homo sapiens, with language, had a much smaller range, was not even able to leave Africa over 1 million years later. And even in Africa, Homo sapiens almost went extinct about 70,000 years ago, which our primate cousins did not, so speaking humans were a pretty unimpressive, unadapted ape. What is really impressive is what happened next. Anthropologists call it the cognitive revolution, which happened right after that near extinction about 70,000 years ago, leading to humans literally taking over the world. How is it possible? Seems miraculous, and it is miraculous. This event is world-changing, and like any major event, it has many facets. In this case, I will present it from 3 different angles. First, tradition. Before the cognitive revolution of 70,000 years ago, good ideas would emerge by random chance, like a better way to make a spear, or a better way to hunt buffalo. But most of those ideas would not get very far in either space or in time because they would get misunderstood or forgotten. Only a small percentage would get preserved and improved upon by pure chance over huge periods of time. What changed with the cognitive revolution is people figured out how to preserve important information by transmitting it across generations. When Isaac Newton said he could see further because he stood on the shoulders of giants, he was talking about tradition. Tradition essentially created a collective brain, which can accumulate knowledge over large distances, not just in space, but especially over time. In other words, tradition is the real superintelligence, the real singularity. Tradition is like compound interest, except instead of money, it's about stories of knowledge and wisdom which accumulate exponentially generation by generation, far beyond the limits of individual lifespan or memory. Second, immune system. Another perspective on the cognitive revolution of 70,000 years ago is that stories like this were invented. The eagle spirit which protects our tribe is all-seeing and all-knowing and punishes those who steal from others in our tribe. So even though I'm hungry and it would be easy to steal some grain from my neighbor's hut, I will instead go and offer to share some of my meat with him next time I hunt in exchange for some of his grain today. This kind of story provides immunity against propaganda. It's a propaganda vaccine. It facilitates and enables a new level of cooperation between people with one crucial condition. It must reside in the heads of all the individuals in a given group. If it does, then that group immediately becomes highly adaptive and competitive against other groups, because its members are much better collaborators, they are more cohesive, and especially, it allows much larger groups to remain stable, thousands of people, which was not possible with purely family-based groups, which only allows for cooperation up to about 150 people or so. Before tribes, people only lived in extended family groups because the only biological mechanism which allowed for cooperation was shared genes. As soon as people were too distantly related, cooperation would break down, which fundamentally limited the size of human groups. This finally leads us to Richard Dawkins. Replicator. Today, the word tribe or tribal has many negative connotations for us, but that blinds us from a very profound reality. Other than the emergence of life itself, the emergence of the tribe was probably the most important event that ever happened on this planet. It's basically the emergence of a whole new category of life, fundamentally different from everything that came before. Here's what I mean by that. As Richard Dawkins eloquently argues in his book, The Selfish Gene, biology can exist and evolution only has meaning in the context of something he calls a replicator. A replicator is some entity which is able to copy itself many times with high accuracy over many generations of some living thing. If these 3 conditions are met, then selection and evolution kick in, making the replicator more adapted over time, creating increasingly complex organisms around it. A replicator is the basic unit of evolution. Now, the only entity which fit this description between the emergence of life and 70,000 years ago was the gene. So everything about how organisms developed and evolved was constrained by this. Most importantly, cooperation was possible only to the extent that shared genes were involved. Unrelated fish of the same species can move together in a school, which is a form of cooperation, but that's about it. Other than that, they compete for mates and for resources. While bees or ants, which cooperate massively, only do so because within a colony they are all sisters, they share at least half of their genes. But 70,000 years ago, for the first time in 4 billion years, a new replicator came on the scene, the shared tribal story, aka the shared myth. Note that language by itself did not produce replicators, and the famous memes which Dawkins invented and which fill the web today are not actually replicators because only the first criterion is met, ability to copy themselves. The second and third criteria, accurate persistence over many generations, are met only for those things which are part of some tradition which makes efforts to preserve and transmit them. And just like the original replicator, the gene, this new replicator also inhabits an organism. For genes, it was the living cell. For shared stories, it's the human tribe or human community. For the first time ever, intense altruistic cooperation was possible between individuals who are not sharing biological DNA, but cultural DNA. The set of shared myths are the DNA of a human community in the most literal sense. This is not just a loose analogy or metaphor. It's identically the same biological process, but at a different scale. DNA is a piece of information which can be copied accurately, is shared identically by all cells in an organism, and allows those cells to be intensely cooperative and adaptive. A tribal myth is also a piece of information which can be copied accurately, is shared identically by all individuals in a tribe, and allows those individuals to be intensely cooperative and adaptive. So, here's the updated history of intelligence. We're up to 7 transitions. But this is not the end either. In fact, it's the beginning of a whole new cycle in the history of evolution, because the eagle spirit who catches cheaters was not the only kind of story tribes would share. There's also a story like this. At full moon, the medicine man of the enemy tribe drinks the blood of a virgin and becomes a giant which chases us and eats our people alive. Our only hope is to attack the enemy tribe during a new moon, when he is powerless, and kidnap all the virgin girls. This is our old friend propaganda again, but at a higher level, the tribal level. This was incredibly destructive, causing endless tribal warfare and grisly sacrificial, torture, and ritual cannibalism practices. Breaking out of this doom loop was only possible by the invention of even higher level stories, integrating the eagle spirit of one tribe with the badger or whatever spirit of another, telling more complex stories enabling intertribal cooperation. Polytheistic religions provided the new immune system against tribal propaganda, and this is what created civilizations. A civilization is basically a collection of tribes differentiated along lines of division of labor or social class. The more classes, the more advanced the civilization. This 8th breakthrough started about 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East with the culture of Göbekli Tepe, and culminated with the first full-fledged civilization, Sumer of Mesopotamia, 6,000 years ago. So here's the updated summary. We're arriving at the 9th and final cognitive revolution, which is the one happening right now, and we're seeing it around us every day. It's the matrix we live in. This final breakthrough has to do with the emergence of reason. The idea, spelled out by Aristotle for the first time, is that you start from some simple premises, and then you kind of turn the crank of logical deduction to obtain a lot of useful derived knowledge. The key thing is that this, just like any story in general, is still fundamentally a simulation, a model of reality, and it involves spending some effort in exchange for some useful knowledge. In fact, I would claim a rational deductive argument is just a very special kind of story, built by the same story-making machinery, our old friend, the neocortex. Aristotle is credited with the discovery of this new kind of story, but Euclid first applied it most spectacularly. Euclid developed all known geometrical knowledge of the time, starting from 5 simple axioms, and just turning the crank of logical deduction from there. That metaphor is not accidental, by the way, I'll come back to it. Anyway, what Euclid did is the key thing that other sophisticated civilizations, like India in particular, did not have. It is not surprising that when Gutenberg invented the printing press, the second most printed book after the Bible was Euclid's Elements. But why is deductive logic such a big deal? Remember the 3 defining features of replicators: having many copies with high accuracy over a long period of time. With deductive logic, you just need to remember the axioms and a few rules, and then massive amounts of theorems, in other words knowledge, become accessible. In modern terms, deductive logic provides 2 things: a compression method, the axioms, plus an error-correcting system, the rules of logic. So in evolutionary terms, deductive arguments just got a huge evolutionary advantage compared to other stories or knowledge. They are much easier to preserve and transmit across generations. This is tradition on steroids. Deductive reasoning started proliferating, as you would expect from a biological perspective. The first place where this was adopted in earnest was Roman law, and soon after it was inherited into Christian canon law and theology. Christian theology was particularly ripe for adopting this because of its universal monotheistic nature, where the idea of universal truth from which everything else flows came very naturally. The life of Christ, the Gospels, became the set of axioms from which all the rest of reality flows, The material universe results from the first principle of the logos, and this is not surprising because the early church fathers were Greek and were steeped in Greek thought. So the next question is, if deductive reasoning is a replicator, then what is the body which serves to propagate it? Well, a group of people sharing common genes is called a family or clan. A group of people sharing common myths is called a tribe, a village, or a community. But a group of people sharing a set of common rules? This is what today we call institutions, corporations, governments, nonprofits, universities. So to summarize, we live in a world with three kinds of replicators inhabiting three kinds of bodies: genes for biological organisms, myths for communities, and rules for institutions. So here's the full history of intelligence with its 9 revolutions. But there's always a but. Just like for families, language, and for tribal myths, there's a dark side to institutions as well. They may be the best way to allocate resources, but they do this by being controlling to the point of being tyrannical. So it's essential to understand how institutions are different from families and communities. I have summarized the major differences in these 2 columns. Striking the right balance between them is the main focus of this channel going forward. There are 2 fundamentally different modes of thought, or existential modalities. Between them you must navigate if you are to survive this 9th cognitive revolution. Since this distinction will come up often, I need a shorthand to refer to it, and so I will use the term organic versus industrial or mechanical to distinguish between them. And I want to draw your attention to one other dimension on this list, and that is the embodied versus disembodied dimension, because this has especially deep implications. See the previous video on science and religion where this distinction also plays a central role. Here's what it means in this context. An embodied structure is something you feel you are a part of on an existential level, something you identify with. It defines your identity. Strong families and communities are like this. This is good because it facilitates the deep, loving self-sacrifice and commitment without which procreation is impossible. Embodied structures are truly alive. They are living organisms. But this is bad because this same commitment creates deep hostility and violence to other organisms and a never-ending zero-sum cycle of warfare. A disembodied structure is something external, like a tool. Institutions are like this. You can use a tool as an extension of your body, but you do not identify with it. You will not fight to the death to defend it. If needed, you easily abandon it, or it abandons you through layoffs, for example, and you find another one. This is good because it facilitates flexible, scalable, positive-sum cooperation without perpetual violence and warfare. Institutions do business with each other just great, just like gears and clockwork. But this is bad because it does not provide the self-sacrifice, deep altruism, and long-term view required for procreation, so it's ultimately sterile. Once people start treating each other like tools, which is basically what an institution is, organic identity evaporates. A tool is just a tool. It's dead. Now, why is this important? Because this implies a paradox of vitality. Being alive comes with killing other things. Death is baked into life itself. It's actually the lesson of Cain and Abel. This leads to a fundamental trade-off in organizational forms. Life-giving, but potentially destructive. Life-neutral, but ultimately sterile. Which in turn creates a civilizational dilemma. Choose rational institutions and avoid destructive conflicts but face demographic collapse, or choose embodied communities and maintain deep meaning and procreation but risk destructive tribalism. There's clearly a balance, a compromise that we must seek, but the way this dilemma is currently playing out in the world today, option 1 is clearly dominant. Rational institutional replicators have quickly mutated and evolved to dominate every aspect of our lives. The Nobel Prize in Economics for 2024 was all about the central role of rational institutions for economic development. Internally, institutions have developed norms and compliance terminology like corruption, nepotism, discrimination, etc. to exclude any element of family or community. While externally, the corporate marketing or state propaganda permeate everything, backing families and communities into a smaller and smaller corner. This includes advertising and consumer culture. You probably think the horizontal lines on the left side of the image are longer than the ones on the right, but they are the same. People raised in pre-industrial societies do not see this illusion, which demonstrates that industrialization literally rewires our brains, that's right, yours and mine, In fundamental ways we are only starting to understand. And the bottom line is collapsing birth rates and a pandemic of loneliness, meaninglessness, and depression as families and communities disintegrate and collapse. This might seem a bit abstract, so let me tell you a little story and then you'll start seeing it all around you. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States back in 2002. And the last semester of my undergrad program, there was a mandatory technical communications class. It was probably the most useful and valuable class in my entire college education. The professor was also unusually outspoken. She would spend time just bantering and storytelling, and one of the stories she told was of how in the 1980s there were commonly grill-outs and kegs of beer in the courtyard of the engineering department for events like dissertations or promotions. All doors and hallways were open, and the hum of conversations filled the hallways. But the social fabric in the engineering department had degraded through the 90s to the point where by 2002, people would behave like zombies, passing each other without eye contact in quiet hallways where all doors were closed by default and any kind of alcohol or cooking food was banned from the premises completely. Only catering was allowed. She clearly thought something important had been lost, the community, and it had been replaced by institutional procedures and regulations. People could be human on their own time. At work, they would perform their duties according to their institutional roles and responsibilities. This kind of story is everywhere now. You move away from your family to get a better job, and then wonder why it's so hard to find a mate who shares your values, and why it's so expensive and so hard to raise kids. Well, it's because you have no family and no village to support you. Just your job. Music is now totally industrialized and meaningless. Most big names, Taylor Swift, Sabrina Carpenter, even Coldplay, do not write or even in some cases even perform most of their music. They are distribution channels or brands, cogs in the music industry machine. People's clothes, food, furniture, sense of humor, the homes themselves used to tell a story about who they are, when and where they are living, and what they value. Today, the so-called clean Scandinavian furniture design is optimized for being as meaningless as possible. Empty canvases devoid of any meaningful story or values. It takes an expert and close inspection to tell the difference between Bill Gates' dress style and the average car salesman. So, rational institutions are very efficient at remaking the world in their image, just like any good replicator. And families and communities have been slow to adapt. Most of us are gladly slotting ourselves into place inside the matrix. It's just more comfortable that way. But the trade-offs are really starting to bite, and these plots are only from the last couple of decades. But this process started almost 3 centuries ago in France. As a result, by the end of this century, almost 90% of the population of the planet will be in Africa and Asia, the least industrialized parts of the world. Industrialization is starting to resemble a great plague, on the same scale as the 14th century one. Now, let me be perfectly clear. The matrix of rational institutions is not all bad, just like genes or tribes were not all bad. It gave us antibiotics, vaccines, sanitation. I personally, and most of you too, would have been dead many times over due to disease, war, or violent crime, if not for the great benefits of rational institutions like universities, governments, and corporations. But going too far in the industrial extreme is a disease too. So the question becomes, how can we discern between balanced organic stories and industrial propaganda stories? How can we rebuild our families and villages from the ashes of the industrial desert? How can our organic structures adapt? Well, through stories, the right kinds of embodied stories. And if you hit that subscribe button, you'll get notified of the next videos. And if you share your thoughts in the comments, we can work together to discover the kinds of organic story-making mindset we need and the related approaches and life hacks for navigating the latest cognitive revolution and coming out on top on the other side.